it will compel a population to reach fitness faster. So it will give a population the capacity to sort of cull out people or members that are less fit than other members, if you think of like reproductive advantage.
Yeah.
So even though suicide in that case is a disadvantage, even though it's uncorrelated with disadvantages, it will still have the capacity to evolve in a population because it will compel the group toward fitness faster.
So like one of the things that we talk about, and one of the things that Joyner talks about, is like that sort of like that burdensomeness and things like that, that sort of, there's some sort of weird cognition that there may be something about that sort of neurological glitch that was like designed in that.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. There are probably,
fascinating.
Yeah. My guess is what you're looking at when you see suicide is a kind of trade-off that evolution made for other adaptive traits. So in order for us to get altruism, which is what allows us to get to the moon, eliminate smallpox, everything else that we need to be the most dominant species on the planet, the remainder in that evolutionary division is periodic suicide.
So, and even like some of that eusocial suicide, so like Joyner talks about, that there seems to be a biological function that it's hardwired in our brains that we don't understand well. So we've been telling narratives about pain. We've been saying sort of stories that really underscore that we think something is so bad it's almost intolerable. What we aren't talking about are these sort of biological hardwired sort of pathways, so that we don't understand them very well, and that they could have like we could understand them mechanistically, which is sort of fascinating, right?
Yeah, and I'm suspicious that we actually probably won't understand suicide. I imagine that when we get it right, it will feel like general relativity or quantum mechanics. The kinds of things that humans are good at feeling intuitive about are like small objects moving at slow speeds in parabolic arcs, like catching a baseball. No one really needs to be told how to do that, right?
Yeah, Newtonian physics versus quantum theory. A little different.
And the Newtonian stuff makes sense to us. Yeah.
And we're live.
Yeah.
You coasted right into it. Good job. Hey, everybody. We're so excited that you're here. We already have some viewers coming on the line. You've stumbled in. Sorry. You're at the Suicide Prevention social media chat, hashtag SPSM. There's a simultaneous Twitter chat that's going on with this live stream. And I'm really excited. The next couple of weeks, we're going to be featuring student researchers who are doing projects in this SPSM sort of space, that intersection between social media, science, and suicide prevention. And we're going to be talking about some cool stuff. And as you know, hashtag AAS18, the American Association of Suicidology Conference, that is only like, what, 1 week?
10 days.
10 days.
I'm not counting. 10 days.
10 days. Oh, jeez, I better write my slides. It's only 10 days away. So our guests are students who have been doing really, so these are up and coming scientists who've been doing really interesting, we think, field changing work. We're so excited. Cero has just been dazzling us in the pre-stream warm up. We're so excited to have him today. And I am here with Dr. Ray Tucker, who is our student division chair and new faculty at LSU. Ray, tell the people a little bit about yourself and about the Morton J. Silverman Award.
Absolutely. So Raymond Tucker at Raymond P. Tucker. I first year faculty at Louisiana State University, study.
Move the laptop to point at Ray. It's a little weird.
Yeah, we can't see Ray.
Oh, my bad. Okay.
Well, you can on the white
screen. Cut yourself out while he does his intro.
You can on the widescreen, just not on the thumbnail. But go ahead, Ray.
It's okay.
This might be hard.
I'm on the widescreen.
Yeah, Ray, this is hard for April. April, let Ray have some screen time.
It's okay.
It's okay. We promise you'll get plenty of screen time later on, April.
Just move your head.
You can just let Ray have the screen time. Let him have the screen. Back away.
What is the Morton J.
It'll be good. No, April, we'll process this, baby. We'll get you through this. Thank you, Ray.
You're welcome. The Morton Silverman Award goes to a student every year of AAS who submits a peer review manuscript that's reviewed by leading scientists in our organization, and they determine every year was really difficult, a top paper. And that paper in the last handful of years have been manuscripts that ended up being published in whether that's suicide, life-threatening behavior, even broader, larger journals. They've been really, really strong work. Ian's certainly the exact same thing. So we're excited. I'm excited to hear more about his project. And if you're going to be at AAS 18 in 10 days, come check out Ian give a presentation of this paper on Friday afternoon. It'll be with the AAS Student Data Blitz. So Ian's going to give this rockin' paper talk, and then other students are going to give about 3 to 4 minutes to give a whole talk on one of their research studies. So you're going to see a lot of science going on.
And not only that, but if you've been to SPSM, you'll already sort of know what he's going to talk about, and you'll be ready to heckle him.
I'm looking forward to it. Can I put in one more plug too?
Sure.
Yeah. So if you want a more intensive discussion of the methods in this paper and how they work and how you can do them, it'll be part of a symposium on Thursday at 4:45 in Capitol Room A, hosted by Keeney Law. So it'll be a little bit more detail on how to do it yourself if that's what you're looking to do.
Oh, cool.
And can we tweet that? Do you have a Twitter opening? Can we tweet out that information so we don't lose it?
Can I? Sure.
I got you, Ian. I'll tweet it. Yeah.
Because I would not remember. I almost tweeted out AAS 15 like it was like our first rodeo. Okay, so this is really fun, and this is going to be one of those sort of meaty, like science-y things that SPSM loves to do. And one of our favorite people who loves this kind of stuff, Dr. Bart Andrews. Dr. Bart Andrews, say hello to the people.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to SPSM. I am so excited about this show. The dissertation that Ian did is the sort of dissertation that I wish so many folks were working on. This is novel. It's innovative. It's connecting some dots. I think one of the things that's really cool about this is that there's some pieces of this that reflect and reinforce my view of what contagion is and what contagion isn't. And I hope we might actually have that conversation because there's some important stuff in here. Just saying hey to everybody. Dr. Bart Andrews, Vice President of Telehealth, Home and Community Services at Behavioral Health Response, a groovy little crisis line in St. Louis, Missouri. The Cardinals lost today. A little bummed about that because they looked like crap. And I'm going to pass it on to my chairman of the board, Tony Wood.
Hey everybody, I'm Tony Wood. I'm the CEO of Quantify. If you'll take a second, not right now, to go over and check out ourdatahelps.org, that would be fantastic. Donate your data today for mental health research. Also the chairman of the board of the American Association of Suicidology, suicidology.org. We happen to be having an upcoming conference, as we might have mentioned already. Ray Tucker, what are the dates on that conference?
Next Wednesday through next Saturday, whatever those days are.
Saturday, Washington, D.C.
Yes.
There or B Square.
18th through the 21st.
Through the 21st.
Are you like co-chair of the conference commission? You like I don't want to call you out on this, Ray. I don't want to draw attention to this, but shouldn't you actually know the friggin' dates of the friggin' conference, man?
Bart, I can tell you how many abstracts were submitted, the exact number. Can't tell you the dates of the conference, but I know it's coming up.
Show up sometime next week or whatever. It'll be fine. Whatever.
How many abstracts were submitted, Ray?
I'm curious, Ray.
In the 480s, 483, I believe, is the number.
483 abstracts.
How many were accepted?
Suicide.
Don't know the number of acceptances.
What? 10. 10 of them were accepted.
10.
Everybody, could you say hello to Chris Maxwell?
Hey everybody, I'm Chris Maxwell, Communications Coordinator for the American Association of Suicidology. I am thrilled to get to hear what Ian has to say. The pre-show has been blowing my mind, hearing him talk about some of this amazing research. So I'm really excited about that. Another thing, I actually just tweeted out a link to the conference page in case you want to register. You can also find it at suicidology.org. And you only have hold on. Tuesday is the last day that you can register for the conference online. So if you haven't registered yet and you've been procrastinating, you need to go do it before Tuesday. Otherwise, you'll have to wait until you get to the conference.
And look, we're already on our second hotel.
I had a
for
question.
Right?
Why don't we have a Twitter card for the conference link?
Man, you're going to be asking me questions about. You're going to ask me questions about the website right now.
No,
we're gonna.
No, you're not.
I just did.
It's gonna happen.
Ian Cero, you are the Mort J. Silverman Award winner and a real person with a bio.
That's correct.
That bio?
A very grateful person. Yeah. What is the bio?
Yeah.
Sure. Well, I'm a student right now at Auburn, working on my internship at the Charleston Consortium, and in the coming months, I'll be at the University of Rochester Medical Center. The stuff that I think we were talking about tonight was related to my dissertation, which I submitted for the Silverman Award, and I'm very grateful to have received.
And you were like talking about this being an extension of like some ideas that you had during your master's thesis. In fact, when I started looking through your papers, you have like quite a body of work.
Oh, thank you. I'm pleased to have it, but it's if there's a theme that you've noticed, it was by accident. I've wandered around a lot, and I've had fun on the journey.
And now you're blushing, so now like I'm gonna not take the bait.
Sure.
So much restraints happening right here, right now. So tell us a little bit about this project. Tell us a little bit about this research.
So this research, I guess, like we had been talking about earlier, was kind of inspired by some replication failures that I had early on in my graduate career. So I noticed some stuff that I thought would replicate really didn't, and I started getting paranoid. And I wondered if the body of suicide research that we had built over the past 50 years might be on shaky or maybe just not very advantageous ground. And so I started looking to other fields like physics and biology for tricks that we could use to maybe start building a foundation that would give us incremental progress. And in that process, I'm not sure this paper can deliver that on its own, but in that process, I found some tools that I thought would really give us the chance to think differently about suicide. And so I looked at some findings that I saw in biology that showed that there are a number of different cases where if you look at a network of organisms or maybe a network of people, the similar people tend to cluster together, and they cluster together on attributes that don't even always make sense to cluster. So in humans, we've observed smokers tend to hang out with smokers, happy people tend to hang out with happy people, overweight people tend to hang out with overweight people, but also tall people tend to hang out with tall people, and people with acne tend to hang out with people who have acne, right? And so I thought if that ended up being the case for suicide, we could use the network mathematics to exploit that pattern. In other words, if birds of a feather flock together, we only really need to know the location of one or two birds to infer the location of the whole flock. And my thought was we could trick the math into telling us where the people that we couldn't find are. That was the goal, at least.
So for you, like you're doing this dissertation project that is allowing or is a possible method for identifying a flock of people who might have suicide risk based on their network, based on if you look at the whole network, you can sort of see who might be connected.
Yeah. So digital media give us the capacity to measure human behavior in this unprecedented level of precision. And there are a lot of critiques of how precise, but no one's arguing that it's worse than before. It's way better. For example, this dissertation alone analyzed 65 million tweets across 17 million people. And that was all done for basically nothing. I did it on a Raspberry Pi, which is a $20 credit card sized microcomputer. So you can do massive research with
something you got off Amazon.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's real cheap. And which I think gives it a lot of promise for the future, because one of the things that suicide research runs into is scalability. So if you look at the effectiveness of DBT, it's great. Like we know that it'll save lives in randomized controlled trials, but giving DBT to everyone who wasn't going to come to your office in the first place is a really difficult thing to do. Finding people online is much easier and much cheaper. So my thought was we can figure out what the social network of a person looks like by just looking at who they're interacting with. And if two people mutually interact on Twitter, so one replies, A replies to B, and then B replies back to A, maybe not at the same time, but at least once over the course of a given period of time, then they probably know each other in some way. Maybe not in person, but they know each other online. And then the question is, well, are all of the people who are interacting similar in terms of their attentiveness to suicide? Are they using words that are related to suicide more often with each other? And are people who are not using those words more likely to be connected to each other? So in other words, do the suicidal people or the suicide talking people tend to cluster together, and the people who are not talking about suicide tend to cluster together?
And you didn't measure SPSMers.
I may have. So I collected a random sample of a 1% random sample of all of the real-time data on Twitter for about 2 months. So that ends up being a little under a terabyte of data. And so you all might be in there. I guess I haven't really checked.
I didn't sign that consent form in Cero.
Well, you did it in public, so sorry for writing down what you did.
So I would love for just really quickly, that was an excellent introduction. I want to give a chance for some of the panel to check in. I'm looking at all of them and they're all thinking things. But no one's going to jump in.
Are we supposed to talk now, April? I'm so confused. I didn't. Yeah. There's so much richness in the study, right? I mean, the lit review that you did and the work that you did that set up your hypothesis and the premise was just incredibly thoughtful. It's clear that you've been working and chewing around the edges of this for a bit. One of the questions that occurs to me, because I think that with Dr. Craig Bryan's work and Dr. Coppersmith and the big push for social media and using social media data to predict suicide, which I'm all for and I think is great. I got some questions, and if we can get to them, great. If not, but one, are we sure that this assertivity that we see on social networks, right, would also occur in real life without, or is it a mechanism of the actual social media itself? My concern is this, that people seem to be much freer disclosing, and it's easier to see other people disclosing suicide thoughts. Whereas in the real world, people aren't saying, I'm thinking about suicide, and then people are gloming onto each other in that sense, right? Because here's this very public, visible statement. So that's one of the questions. So let's start there. What do you think? How generalizable are these to outside of the social media platform?
Sure. So I guess there are kind of two ways to kind of get at that question. One empirical and one more principled or anecdotal. Empirically, we know that at least in the case of other mood-related phenomena, so there are researchers that have studied happiness, assortativity on Twitter, and researchers who have studied happiness in offline networks. And the assortativity coefficients are significant in both cases and tend to be pretty similar. So at least for mood-related phenomena, the stuff that we find on Twitter specifically tends to map onto the Framingham Heart Study networks that Christakis and Fowler have studied offline.
It's the second time I've heard about the Framingham. Tony will tell us how to say it. Like in what, 3 weeks?
Yeah.
It's a good one.
Tell us some more about that study and what that is, because this ends up being relevant to a bunch of other research in suicide.
All right. Well, I am not one of the people who conducted that research, but I'll try hard to represent it.
You would be worth a lot of money if you had.
Yes. So if I'm remembering right, the Framingham Heart Study has been going on for decades, and it was a study of the town of Framingham and the people who lived in it to try and track what were the kind of phenomena that were associated with heart risk, hence its name. And what's unique about this particular study is that the researchers also collected a lot of information on who your social contacts were, and they've done that for several generations and doing it, at multiple time points over and over and over again. So it's an ongoing study. As far as I know, it's still ongoing. And that has created accidentally a rich data set for people who are interested in studying social phenomena, even though that wasn't the original intent of the framers of Framingham. And see what I did?
Tony liked it.
Yeah. And so what Christakis and Fowler are probably the two, at least most famous researchers who have looked into the network phenomena that can be investigated with the Framingham Heart Study, which is one of the areas, or one of the ways that we know that happiness is assortative offline. So all of the people who were in that study filled out information on their mood in addition to their heart health, and we also know who their social contacts were. So we can ask, are the happy people in consistent contact with other happy people? Are the sad people in consistent contact with other sad people? In that particular case, there's even evidence suggesting that happiness has a kind of contagious effect. So if you are sad, but friends with someone who is happy at time 1, you yourself are more likely to turn happy at time 2. Wow. There are some methodological concerns about whether or not that could just be an odd kind of homophily, which is mathematically possible. And right now,
you're going to have to explain to me an odd kind of homophily.
Sure. Okay. So there are, whenever you're looking at assortativity, which is the propensity of people in a network to be connected to other people who are similar. So, for example, if you're looking at like a kindergarten class, the boys tend to sit with boys, the girls tend to sit with girls. That's an assortative network. And if you can get assortative patterns in a network by 3 different mechanisms. It could be contagion. So if we're looking at something social, maybe I'm sad and we were already friends, so I influence you to become sad like me. Contagion across the link. Homophily might be we weren't friends, but we both noticed that we were sad, so we decided to hang out because people tend to like being around similar people. That's like birds of a feather flock together is the homophily explanation. And then the less sexy explanation is a shared environment. So if you're thinking in terms of suicide, imagine that you've got a bunch of people who work at the same factory. They all get laid off. They know each other because of the factory, and their suicide risk is now elevated because of the factory. So what you'll notice is that the people who are socially connected all tend to be suicidal in that case. But it's not because of anything unique to the network. It's because the network happens to be manifested on a shared environment. In the case of contagion, one of the things that we're wondering about is whether or not what we're really observing is just some subtle form of homophily. So maybe it's possible that people are seeking each other out in a way that represents a propensity toward happiness that would look like longitudinal contagion, but is in fact just assortative homophily. People are hanging out with other people who are subtly similar to them in a way that our statistics are having a difficult time detecting. The unfortunate feature of this is that there was a paper, I think in Shalizi in 2013, if I'm remembering right, showed that it's possible to get assortative patterns that look like contagion with tricky forms of homophily. And right now, our statistics don't have the capacity to distinguish between them. We just don't have a way of knowing.
So let me make sure I understand.
Okay.
People can be alike in ways that are like hard for our brain to sort of consciously and simplistically recognize, but in a complex makeup can be more similar. And so it may be that you were saying, oh, this person is sad and this person is happy, but there are a whole bunch of things they have in common. And so the sad person becomes happier because of maybe some very complex mechanisms.
Exactly. Maybe, so if you've worked at all with latent variables before, you can have a bunch of people who look very different on an observed survey, right? We're checking very different boxes, and if you looked at our 2 scores right next to each other, we could look like very different people. But if you look at our latent scores on, say, something like the post-traumatic checklist or the Beck Depression Inventory, we might actually have very similar latent scores. When you reduce us down to one dimension that cannot be directly observed, we're actually quantitatively very similar. And it's possible that that's happening underneath the hood.
So like all of the SPSM production crew, like Bart and I are tight and we're very different people, but we're all Midwesterners and have some interesting, no, we are. And we're all like, some of us very close. And so there's probably ways that we are complexly similar because of similar environment or similar complex things, even though we look a lot like different on paper, right?
Right, and in fact, if you
Kansans. Explain this. Wait. 3 of them were Kansans, though.
Yeah.
Because
I want to just clarify for that. I just want to clarify for the group that I'm not a Kansan. I just want to put that out there. I don't want to be tagged in that, but okay.
Thank you for your apology, Bart.
Moving on.
Keep going.
Keep going.
Get us back on track.
All right. So one of the ways that we can try to deal with this in suicide, or at least maybe take these patterns that we observe in nature and the patterns that we see in other forms of human social behavior, is to try and exploit them in the case of suicide. So In my particular dissertation, I was interested in 4 questions that kind of happen in sequence. The first is, if we collect a large amount of Twitter data that we can use to infer who's interacting with whom, if we score the things that everyone is saying as including words that are related to suicide or not including words related to suicide, and then we also score them as involving words that are sad and words that are not sad. Now you're probably thinking, aren't those all the suicidal words? But it turns out that there's actually a significant amount of non-overlap between words that are related to suicide and words that are related to sad. Like rope, for example, is a word that could be pretty strongly related to suicide, but on its own doesn't have any intrinsic sadness. The 4 questions are, is suicidal talking, just talking about suicide, assortative to any degree? 2, if it is assortative, to what degree is it assortative? So am I just similar to the people that I know, or is there a subtle form of assortativity that extends beyond just the people that I know? So am I more similar to the friends of my friends' friends, whom I've never met and never will, than we would expect by chance? And 3rd, if those 2 things are true, then can we really just chalk this all up to mood? In other words, we know that mood is assortative. We were just talking about the Framingham Heart Study. We know that people who are happy tend to be with happy people. People who are sad tend to spend more time with sad people. Maybe because suicide is something that tends to co-occur with sadness, this is all just attributable to mood, and there's no unique value of the assortativity of suicide. And then 4 is, if all of those things are true, can we exploit that pattern to do better screening? And so if I can, can I take them in order? Is that all right?
You do you.
All right. So what we found is that people who are talking about suicide or using words that are related to suicide on Twitter are reliably connected with one another. So if you are talking about suicide, you are more likely to be interacting with another person who is talking about suicide, maybe even not at the same time, maybe later in that month, but you're more likely to be connected to people who are using those words overall than you are to be connected to someone who's not using those words. Likewise, if you are not talking about suicide ever, you're more likely to be connected to someone who's not talking about it ever. We found that effect is significantly assortative up to 6 degrees of separation. So the friends of my friends' 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 friends are more similar to me than you would expect by random chance alone, which suggests that there's non-zero information that we get on your behavior based on what someone in Europe is doing, all the way across the ocean, connected by 6 different people whom you will never meet in your life. 3rd, we found that effect remains significant up to 2 degrees of separation once mood is controlled, suggesting that at least in local areas of your network, still extending beyond people that you know, suicidal behavior is uniquely assortative in ways that can't be attributed to mood. There is something special about suicide-related talking that brings people together, and we don't know why. And then finally, the question is whether or not we can improve risk detection based on exploiting that pattern. So if birds of a feather flock together, we only need to know the location of 1 or 2 birds to find the whole flock. And so I ran simulations at the end of the study to see whether exploiting that assortative pattern found more people with the same number of screens. And in a relatively large network, you can essentially double the number of true positives that you find for the same number of screens. In other words, you can make your resources twice as efficient.
So like if you're doing a bunch of screens about known risk factors and we know who's in your network, we can more accurately predict someone who's at risk. Yeah,
and you can make fewer predictions to get the same number of people. You save time and energy. So the metaphor that I use to set this up is to think about a school psychologist who's called into a high school, maybe it's a small high school of only 100 or so people, into that school after someone's died by suicide. The principal and the teachers are all justifiably concerned because they have maybe read this work that are wondering whether or not there are other people in the school who are at risk for suicide. So that particular school psychologist has 2 options. She can screen everybody at random because she knows she's not going to be able to screen 100 people, right? She's got time maybe for 10 or 20, so she won't be able to hit the whole population. So she grabs a list of all of the students in the school, grabs a random 20, and she'll probably find some people who are at risk for hurting themselves, or maybe some people who need help in some other way. Another option that she's got is to ask one of the teachers who the top 5 friends of the decedent are. Grab those people, and among them, find out which ones are at risk for suicide. Take those aside, ask them who their friends are. Then go to that third ring, ask who's at risk for suicide. Among the positives in that ring, ask who their friends are, and so on. So you have this kind of snowball effect where you're asking each ring of positives to give you more people. And if you do that, you will get reliably more positive screens for the same number of screens conducted. Depending on the configuration of the network and depending on the size of the network, you'll get a different advantage. Because these effects are nonlinear, the larger the network, the more powerful the effect will be. So in the way that I did this was by taking subclusters of the network in Twitter, and I found that in the example where we're talking only about 100 people, you can get, you know, maybe 1 or 2 extra people for the same number of screens. But if you allow yourself to be sampling from a population of about 7,000, you can double the number of screens from about 200 to somewhere between 350 and 400 positives for the same number of
true
screens.
Positives, like not false, but true positives, which is
true positives.
Really, we could get false positives all over the place.
Yeah, no, these are true positives. These are true positives.
Yeah, which is
in the simulations, right? These are not. If you buy the assumptions of the simulations, those are true positives.
Bart.
Well, I'm just one. This is incredible, and when you look at Jonathan Singer's work, The Suicide in Schools, the model that is laid out in that book talks about this very same process without the benefit of this sorting mechanism and this network analysis that could really facilitate a more economical approach. The thing that occurs to me while you're speaking. Because sometimes we see this sort of thing happen where student A dies of suicide, student C dies of suicide. They didn't know each other. Right. They weren't directly connected, but there was a node between them.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So there was this is sort of this network that you're talking about, this assertivity and the connections is there, but it's not always one-to-one, right? It's not the next person in line. And so the question I have is, did we see, or is there a way to look at, or did you see nodes? So for instance, people that seem to have be at the center of more of a cluster, right? So people that had more connectivity with other people in the pool.
So they're going to have more lived experience or more survival because they have more people around them, even though they have not. Oh, wow.
There could be people that have a certain level that they connect more layers together. I'm just thinking out loud. So I don't know if I'm making any sense, Ian.
Are you wondering, are there sort of like suicidal bridges in the network? Is that the question that you're asking? Whether there are people through whom suicide risk is transmitted?
That's exactly what I was saying.
Yeah. So you're talking about a particular network phenomenon called betweenness. Its older word is Banach centrality, B-A-N-A-C-H. For those of you who are big math fans, that is the same Banach. Yeah.
Bert's going to use this all week. Thanks, Ian.
That's if you're a fan, that's the same Banach as the Banach-Tarski paradox. But we're
very familiar. We just don't talk about it a lot in mixed company.
Sure. Yeah. It is one of the more controversial of the paradoxes, both socially and numerically. So the question that I think that you're asking about is betweenness. So imagine that you're looking at different departments in a university, right? And so most people in each department know each other, but they might not know people in other departments. But maybe there's a person who has a dual appointment. That person will be a bridge between those two networks because they know everyone on each side. That's a person who will have high betweenness because they are the conduit through which all of the shortest paths pass. And it might be the case that there are people who are not themselves suicidal, but there is something about them that draws suicidal people to them that facilitates them being this kind of risk bridge. I don't have an answer to that in this particular study, but I can show you that we see phenomena that are like that. Is it all right if I pull up the figure?
Yeah,
like absolutely. And can I just say, like, we do have those experiences with patients where they're like, and then this friend killed themselves, and then this friend attempted, and like, I mean, we do anecdotally have that experience with folks in the clinical realm.
So for me, the question is, I think about Matt Knox's work with the Army STARS project, and one of my favorite findings from that research is that 57% of the people who are reporting current suicide risk, some form of suicide risk, a recent attempt, active ideation, report that suicidal behavior or that suicide concern began prior to enlistment. And so what it would look like if you're not very careful would be that something about military experience is causing suicidal behavior. But in actuality, there's something about the military that is drawing people who were already at risk to it. And I'm wondering if when we see those clusters, we attribute contagion to them because contagion is the sexier, seductive explanation. It feels like something that in principle we could intervene on, but is ultimately just a trick of a kind of underlying homophily. And I don't have an answer to that question, but I'm suspicious
Contagion
that
instead of a trick of an underlying homophily. I'm going to totally use this.
it's by all means. By all means, I don't have the copyright to homophily.
I will tell you that we, here in Louisiana, we did have a military unit that had multiple suicide attempts and veterans on the high risk list. And it turned out, and it took a while to figure it out, that they had all grown up in the same region, many of them together, really similar kinds of work, similar kinds of economic issues, similar, very small region, very specific culture, and sort of related in a really, really interesting way. But it took a while for us to figure that out. And then the question is, did they make each other suicidal? Was it that we were all in despair by this initial death and then whatever, or was there something about this environment that they grew up in? And it was really, really, and of course, the second question that I have is, can you use assortative networks to be tactical about how you intervene? Because I can I think we're just right on the edge of being able to deploy suicide risk assessment at scale. We are not just on the cusp of deploying intervention on scale.
Yeah. So one of the things that I wanted to do was make that workable. I'm not sure whether this research gets us all the way there, but I think it can get us close. So if I call up this network, this is a subset of the Twitter network in September of, I guess it would have been 2016. The darker nodes are the people who have talked about suicide at least once in the last month. The lighter nodes are people who have not done so in the last month. Dark nodes are circled when they are directly connected to at least one other person who is talking about suicide. Bart, to answer your question, if you want to look at people who are these kind of like suicide bridges, look at the crow's foot shape on the left. All the way on the left, you've got 3 nodes that are connected to one non-suicidal one.
I see it.
Tucker and I are pointing as if you can see where we're pointing. Can you like hover a cursor over?
Yeah.
Because we're like, oh yeah, it's right there.
Can you see my cursor?
Yeah.
Okay. Now also look at these two. These two are connected. It's hard to see, but they're connected by this person. These two are connected by this person. Just about everyone in this network is connected. If you are talking about suicide, you're connected to almost every other suicidal person by 2 degrees of separation. If you don't know anyone who is, you know someone who knows someone who is.
It's just incredible, Ian. Jeez Louise.
So,
and these are phenomena that are ubiquitous in human social relationships.
It's like if you're looking at, I wish I had a pointer that worked in the digital space. So but like I'm just seeing like you could really narrow this down to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like 6 or 7 people that if you possibly raised their health or intervened with them effectively, it might theoretically it's possible that it would have a downstream health promoting effect on others.
Well, that depends. So if the mechanism of their...
I want to break in and say there could be a whole other set of people that are totally unstudied here that you could influence that would get you the results you wanted by interrupting some of these or by otherwise messing with these sort of network effects in one way or another.
Yeah, so the crow's foot over here might be a good example of that. If we can help this person in some way who's already healthy, you could have an effect on these people who are having more trouble over here. Yeah,
so you don't really need to. The upstream downstream thing kind of gets tossed in this conceptually gets tossed away, and this is the new hotness that Ian is bringing to us.
Thank you.
Please someone me the new hotness.
I'm on it.
Sorry, go ahead.
So I want to emphasize something that I think is really important to this research, and I. Originally thought of it as a limitation, but I'd actually reframe that to be a strength of this study. So most
I like your style.
Thank you. Most of the historic research on suicide contagion has been focused on whether suicide clusters that we observe in schools or sometimes in cities are really contagion or homophily or shared environment. The goal has been to figure out what the cause of those patterns is. And like I said, there was a paper a couple years ago that showed with the current quantitative tools that we have, you just can't know. In the same way, April, you were talking about those 3 people that you had worked with, and it's just really not possible to know. Was it the environment they came from? Was it that they were talking to each other? Was it they would have been at risk anyway? And none of the research that I've done can differentiate between any of those things. In fact, explicitly, I say in the paper that I'm not even going to try, because I don't think that we need to know why assortativity is happening in order to exploit it. So in this case, we don't need to know why all of these people are connected in the way that they are. We just need to know what that pattern looks like in order to infer the location of people whom we don't know. In other words, we don't need to know why birds of a feather flock together in order to know that if we find a couple birds, we know where the whole flock is. They could be doing it because they're communicating magnetically. They could be doing it because they just think it's cool, but it'll work as long as we know what the pattern looks like. Now, in this case, yeah.
Now, we've only got 20 minutes, and the facts are like, we're still hooked. If you get to the bacteria stuff, great. If not, you should do a teaser on that. We should do a second show, and I'm not shitting you. Keep going.
All right, I'm in. If you wanna keep talking, I'm all. I was gonna say all ears, but all mouth, I guess. So if you're looking at this screen again, if we want to know how to use this for intervention, you can think about the digital interventions that other people are designing. So this isn't something that I've studied myself, but you can imagine app-based interventions, the kind that, say, someone like Joe Franklin has explored. We need to know who to send those to. If we know that this person here is talking about suicide, we know to send the app to this person's friends around here. And we'll get some false positives, but we know that we will get a much greater effect by targeting this person's friend than targeting the network at random. So that would be one of the ways that you could use this research, both for screening and for intervention. It does not give you the kind of information that you need to intervene directly, but it can facilitate the amplification of other powerful interventions.
Like, you know, I don't want to be controversial, but like sort of the whole fake news and like figuring out which people to send what messages to slightly nudge behavior. Like you could do all kinds of interventions if it's about their public feeds and you know who they're connected to and you know they're at risk. Mm-hmm. Now there are ethics involved. Those are other episodes and we've done those episodes, but like fascinating.
Yeah.
Bart.
So my personal
Oh, Bart's giving Bart face.
Yeah. What's up?
Well, I think we've got a lot of issues around this, but I mean, as Ian's talking about this, I mean, we know from Facebook manipulations that you can change people's mood based on altering their feed and changing their feed, right? We know there's this weird thing about blue lights, and that blue lights seem to reduce suicide behavior. That if you put blue lights up in certain situations where people are more prone to jump or attempt suicide, they're less likely to do so. So when we talk about scalability, and we talk about the idea that we could change the environment. Could you change that person's feed? Could you send things into that person's timeline or into their feed and change the environment around that person? Would that be unethical to do? So I don't think so. Even though people are going to take a different take on that, but the idea that we could do these things is feasible, right? Yeah. The question is, how do people feel about having their mood and their environment tweaked based on an algorithm identifying them being in this link of assertivity with other people at risk of suicide? That's the real question. But we're starting to get it
and say that you've just described what advertising is.
Yeah, I was about to say there's no such thing as algorithmic neutrality.
Yeah.
The choice of a sloppy algorithm.
Someone name that too. There's no such thing as algorithmic neutrality.
That's right. Yeah, the name of my next punk band.
That's right. That's good.
7-car pileup.
Yeah, there's not, and Tony, I'm sure that you've thought about this, but every algorithm will have some set of consequences. The question is not whether we choose a neutral algorithm or an algorithm that injects a bunch of random noise so it feels neutral. It's whether we choose one whose default is consistent with our values.
I think there's a way for us to behave ethically. As I've said many times, I believe that what we're doing in this industry, that's the industry we're in at Quantify. And so therefore I accept the bias that comes from making my living this way. But I believe we are building a screwdriver, and you can take it and put your IKEA furniture together, or you can jam it in your thigh, and we can't stop you. So we've got to try to build the tools that people are going to use to be productive and be better and use them to make society better. But we can't promise there's going to be no negative consequences. Because that's just not the way that's not the way science seems to have worked out.
So I have a question. Can I jump in real quick? The question I have is, so this was research based off of looking at interactions on one social media platform, right?
Right.
So do you have any idea? Do you have any supposition as to like how well those kinds of interactions will translate? I mean, obviously, like you were talking about, a lot of these things that we're talking about, just the idea of assortativity in general is pretty ubiquitous. But is it translatable to different social media platforms? Mm-hmm. And even in terms of, obviously, we talked about this on the show too, is that people communicate very differently depending on which social media platform they're on. Oh, yeah. They might be, very willing to share information about their mental health on Facebook or Twitter, mm-hmm. but very guarded on something like Reddit. Right. So
like Facebook is everyone you knew in high school. Twitter is everyone you wish you knew in high school.
Yes. Yeah. So is there a way to go back and like refine depending on which platform you're looking at? How do you imagine that working?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to. Part of the reason that we went to Twitter instead of Facebook, which was our initial goal, was the data are much more accessible. Twitter just makes it really easy to get their data, and so that was low-hanging fruit that made sense to pursue. You would probably expect different assortativity coefficients on different networks. So if you're looking at Facebook, my suspicion would be that you would actually see a stronger assortativity coefficient for exactly the reasons that you described, which is that people are more willing to share more openly with each other. And so you might expect it to be easier for them to find people who are similar to them. You can also expect that on Facebook, more people who you've met historically offline. And for that reason, you would also get some additional assortativity from historic shared environments. So we might even expect those effects to be more powerful on other forms of social media, especially Facebook. But those data are a little bit harder to get, so I haven't addressed them here, but that's on the agenda for sure.
Sure. But the idea that it can be, I mean, basically just you have to run the same research on whichever platform you're looking at.
Yeah, and actually, if you had enough platforms and enough people from each platform, it's not unrealistic to imagine using something like a hierarchical linear model to just infer what the distribution of assortativity coefficients across platforms is. And so in that sense, you might not need to measure every single network and every single subcluster of that network. But if you can infer what that distribution is like with some safety, if your sample size is large enough, then you can still get away safely having a prediction method across networks. Is that clear?
Ray Tucker has just been having intimate moments with some of your methodology explanations. So I just want for Ray, can you briefly break in and explain why you are reacting to Ian's methodology with the passion that I just got to hear because you were on mute?
You see some of the algorithms being ran in platform specific. And then that is one of the first questions that somebody with an applied background or really wanting to understand the applied nature, what can I do with this right now? And that's one of the first things we start to hear. And we see this with like the predictive models of like in electronic health records and like, what if I'm not in a place that has these, or, I'm not interacting in that space, what can I use out of that? Just to say that with this methodology, there's a possibility of doing this across platforms, but also testing across platforms with a big enough sample size, I just think is awesome. That's just awesome.
So, I mean, what you all are saying is there could be digital signals that are platform specific, and there could be digital signals that are robust against some platforms or set of platforms. We might be able to find enough digital signals that we could then have sort of an embarrassment of riches and find the ones that are more robust or more generalizable, et cetera.
Yeah, I actually think that we can be sloppier than people are allowing themselves to be right now. So the thought is that, ooh.
Sorry, keep going.
All right. So
student years foreman. No.
I know. They're so sweet and innocent. Keep going.
So I think it was John Locke who said we don't need a line that is long enough to tell us how deep the ocean is. We only need it to be long enough to tell us whether our boat is going to run across the rocks. The assortativity coefficient that I found in this particular network was about 0.10. So if you imagine a correlation of 0.10, that means about 1% of the variability in these phenomena is accounted for by assortativity alone, which is pretty weak. But we don't need to know whether it's strong or weak to know that snowball-oriented sampling is a much better strategy than random sampling. If we have good assumptions that human behavior should be assortative in other networks, we actually don't even need to know how assortative to know what kinds of decisions to make. We only need to know that it's a better idea to snowball sample than to random sample.
Oh Lordy, we're in the last 10 minutes.
Sure.
Home stretch.
Okay.
I know what this is a terrible idea, but I'm doing it anyway.
Okay.
Tell us about suicidal bacteria.
Okay. So this is not my research. This is research in behavioral ecology.
I know, but your face and our faces, like give us a little tease, and then we'll do final thoughts. Yeah, take a minute.
Okay.
I agree.
Sure. So there are some researchers who were interested, and we can put the citation in the show notes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So there are some researchers who were interested in the development of altruistic sacrifice, and one of the ways that you want to study that is experimentally, if you can. And you would also like to be able to do it across species. And so these researchers took E. coli, kept one group of them the same, and genetically altered another group of them to cause them to automatically self-destruct when they came in contact with a normally lethal virus. So bacteria really don't like viruses. Viruses kill bacteria all the time. So these bacteria, if they are in the experimental suicide-capable group, will self-destruct when they come in contact with that virus. The normal group will get infected. Maybe it'll live, maybe it'll die, but they're normal. So they took those two groups. They were interested in what are the conditions under which suicide, or at least something that looks like suicide, can evolve. They poured those two groups into a beaker, then dumped some virus into the beaker, and the non-suicidal bacteria rapidly outcompeted the suicidal bacteria. The suicidal ones were very quickly extinct. That makes some sense because every time they touched a virus, they died. Their counterparts at least had some chance to live. But when those researchers took those same bacteria, put those two groups on a flat petri dish, put some ball bearings into the petri dish and shook it a little bit, so they're mixed up a little bit, but not as much as they were in the beaker, what you find is that the suicide-capable bacteria rapidly outcompete the non-suicidal counterparts. So it's not that the gene itself is adaptive in all contexts. It's adaptive depending on the social network in which these non-social bacteria are put. Right? Bacteria aren't social species, but the network in which they're housed determines whether suicide evolves. And the reason that happens is because on a flat plate, if you've got a big colony of many bacteria and the virus comes to the edge of them, it will self-destruct all of the bacteria on the edge, and the center will be protected by the burn wall of dead bacteria on the outside. So it is the fact that those bacteria are arranged in assortative clusters that allows suicidal behavior to evolve in the first place.
I mean, there's a piece of this that is saying, what if suicide isn't like a social narrative about your stress, or like you were bullied, you killed yourself, something like very overly simplistic. What if it has, there are mechanisms behind it that make it make sense in certain contexts, or make it sort of be part of our design internally.
Right.
And that, like, if we know that's true, does that change how we think about it or how we do research about it?
It certainly should. So if the only conditions under which we've been able to experimentally compel it to evolve are conditions of assortativity, that would mean that we should have the capacity, or we should be seeing assortative suicides in humans, which we see every time you look at a suicide cluster. If there is an adaptive advantage to altruistic self-sacrifice, then we should also expect humans to cluster along people who are more prone to altruistic self-sacrifice, because the only conditions in which it's adaptive for me to sacrifice myself is if you would reciprocally do the same for me. So we would expect people for whom those evolutionary scripts get triggered to go to places where they're more likely to find those people, like the military. It might be the reason that we're seeing
self-sacrifice is super important, right? Because you're about ready to go into danger, right? And you just got to believe.
And so if you're the kind of person for whom things are going badly, you're starting to evaluate whether or not it makes more sense for the benefit of the group for you to live, or to put yourself in a risky but defensive, defense-prone situation, then that evolutionary script might compel you to join a bunch of other people who are around to protect everyone else, but are at higher risk of losing their lives, which it would explain the knock stuff that we were talking about earlier, that a majority of the people who are reporting suicidal behavior in the military had that suicidal behavior before they joined.
So we're having a tweet of someone says, how about more resources for those who are miserable but not in imminent danger? And I think,
Sure.
you know, we have people who are talking about feeling great psychic, great emotional pain, but they may not be in danger of dying. And I'm going to tell you that having emotional pain relief in a life worth living is absolutely important. I know we're talking about like a very sort of technical, mathy, sciencey issue, and we're all fangirling and getting very excited about the math. Sure. Thank you for reminding us that these are real people with real pain, and that they deserve pain relief, even if they don't, they never become at risk of dying. And we will definitely talk about technology fixes to relieve pain and suffering. My mission every day, truly. Thank you for pointing that out.
My goal is the mitigation of human suffering. This is just one of the areas in which I happen to be developing expertise.
Yeah. Right, absolutely. And thank you for making sure to voice that. We certainly support that perspective. We are at final thoughts. We're going to do another thing on like on bacteria and contagion, and we're going to have to do a bacteria episode. I just feel it coming. But we are at 5 minutes. So final thoughts. Let's start with Chris.
My brain has been melted. I'll start there. And it's clear that a few of our people on Twitter feel exactly the same way. You've done such an amazing job, Ian, both in the research and then in the way that you explain it, and that you convey and communicate what you're doing and what you're talking about. These are incredibly difficult things, I think, for a lot of people to explain. And so having people like you in this field, in this industry, being able to do it in an effective way is such a valuable skill. So thank you for being here tonight and letting us kind of bask in the gloriousness of your brain. Gloriousness?
I'm flattered.
Yeah. But the other aspect of this.
Oh, sorry, Chris. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say the other aspect that I really like about this research in particular, and the way that you're thinking about this kind of through the process is obviously, you know, you're starting with your question, you're starting with your hypothesis, but you're also kind of simultaneously thinking about how to then go and apply it, how to implement these things. And so that's something that obviously we've been talking about a lot in SPSM and in these circles. How do we get this stuff? And when you started talking about being sloppy, I was right there with you. This is the idea that we need to be you know, effective, but not necessarily perfect. So again, thank you just kind of for thinking about all those different things in these concepts. So yeah, good job.
Thank you. I think a practical focus is one of the important features of work in our field.
Tony Wood, final thoughts.
Every year, our colleagues have a really rough time reviewing the research and deciding who the Morton J. Silverman Award is going to be this year. I think Ian has demonstrated that this area of inquiry is much deserved, deserves the attention. And Ian's work is brilliant, clearly, and we're excited at AAS to extend the Silverman Award.
Thank you. I'm very grateful.
Well, you better be.
I am.
Ray Tucker, final thoughts.
But yeah, echo that awesome multidisciplinary work. I mean, like, you know, unreal. It's not, yeah. We talk about public health perspective, and we talk about taking in a bunch of different fields and multidisciplinary approaches, and having a sort of a tech, social, and then even in a discussion of this sort of evolutionary biological approach, somebody like yourself who's able to draw from research from all these areas and do so in a way that got all of us so quickly on board and understanding is just unreal. It makes me even more excited to hear your talk coming up next week. I will mention real quickly, because I know next week, Brian Bauer from the University of Southern Mississippi, he's a student of Mike Inesis's, he's going to talk about nudge messaging and how these sort of easy, you know, subtle communications, framing things like sending a link about suicide prevention resources in different ways can get people who are suicidal or not suicidal to respond differently, to communicate differently. Actually, I think really jives so well with your ability to, you know, to find that one or two people that make our snowballing so much more effective. Sure. I think Brian is going to be able to, like, I think the next week will jive so well with this. I just think it's super cool.
Thank you.
Go AAS. We have the best students. Yeah. Bart Andrews.
Ian, this is just incredible. I have to say that you are so deserving of this award.
Thank you.
What excites me the most is that you're helping move the field in a direction away from this pathology-based, individual, something wrong, medicalized approach, and getting us to think of in terms of networks, in terms of emergent phenomenon. I think we're seeing a movement in that direction, but we really, really very much need more folks like you. You taught me so much tonight, and I just honored to meet you, sir, and I can't wait to meet you at AS. So thank you for being here. Absolutely phenomenal.
Final thoughts, Ian Cero.
Yeah, I was worried you would ask that question. I feel like I wrote a paper about it, and now I'm kind of speechless. I'm just very grateful to have had the chance to talk to you all. I think this work has been really exciting to do, and I've wanted to be able to share it for a long time with people who are actually doing work in the field. And one of my biggest concerns was that it would just die in a journal somewhere. And so I really want to say thank you for having me on.
Oh, we're so excited. And if you want to talk about bacteria, if we can do a bacteria episode, we're going to find a way. We're going to find a way because it's super cool.
Get Keeney Law together. Like you and Keeney get together and let's do it.
We'll tag team?
Oh my God.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Yeah.
Speaking of tag teaming, I haven't been this excited about snowballing since Clerks. This has been a wonderful evening.
It's been delightful.
I'm sorry. I sat on that all hour. You have been at SPSM, the Suicide Prevention Social Media Chat, for the last hour. Chris Maxwell is going to have all sorts of fun and games doing the sizzle reel tonight. For those of you, and I know several of you said you couldn't keep up with the Twitter and do the live stream. Several of you are going to be watching it tomorrow. Tweet out some of your reactions. Stay in touch with Ian Cero at Ian Cero on Twitter, and come to AAS and like groove and hang out. These folks with these new ideas and new ways of looking at things may very well be the people who, you know, who create the change that saves lives. And that's awesome. Everyone have a great evening.